Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Holly Ainley, Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement at the National Centre for Writing, here at Dragon Hall in Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature. In this episode of The Writing Life, I spoke to novelist Hannah Vincent about point of view and different types of narration. This is a topic she also explores for us in a new free self-paced course for NCW Academy. It's called How to Write Unreliable Narrators, and you can find out more at nationalcenterforwriting.org.uk/academy. Hannah Vincent is a novelist, short story writer and playwright. Her first novel, Alarm Girl, was published in 2014, and her second, The Weaning, in 2018. Her 2020 short story collection, She Clown and Other Stories, was shortlisted for the Edgehill Prize. Her stage plays have been produced by, among others, the Royal Court Theatre and the Royal National Theatre Studio, and her radio play, Come to Grief, won a BBC Audio Award. In our conversation, we delved into the specifics of different perspectives that writers can inhabit, both at a technical level and exploring the effects that different perspectives and voices can have on readers. We talked about why a writer's choice of perspective is fundamental to the way a story is told, and whether any narrative voice can truly be reliable. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Hannah Vincent as much as I did. Hannah Vincent, hi, and welcome to the Writing Life podcast.
Hello, Holly Ainley. Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to talk to you. So we are here today to talk about point of view or narrative perspective. So that is the official description, is the vantage point from which a story is told. Now, I want us to get into the nitty-gritty of all the different points of views, the pros and cons of them, the effects they can have on the story and on reader. But to kick us off, I'm going to ask you straight up, why is point of view so important? Why should we be giving it this airtime today on the podcast?
It's a good question because it is an element of writing prose fiction that tends to confounds me. It tends to kind of confound student writers as well. So it is a good question. Why is it so important? And I think for me, point of view is important because it's an issue of control, and that actually any effective writing, I think, needs to be considered and needs the writer to have thought about what they're doing, what we're doing, with a view to exerting our artistic control over the material that we're generating. And, if you're thinking about the point of view, the perspective from which you are telling a story, then that's really important, and that is part of the creative choice that you're making, or the choices that you're making. And if you're thinking about whose point of view it is you're telling a story from, then you're thinking carefully about your creative choices, and the likelihood is that you'll write more strongly, I think.
Yeah, that's so interesting about control, controlling your reader. But that is exactly what it is. I guess it's that how a story is told can be almost as important as the story itself.
Sure, yeah, and so we could have a story, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. But and everyone knows that story, but there are any number of ways in which you could tell that story or relay that story. And hopefully, if you're a creative writer, then you're going to be creative about the way in which you tell that story. The choices you make are going to influence how your reader receives that story, and what they, whether they come back to see your retelling of Red Riding Hood, for example, And it's you are controlling the reader, but more, I think you're controlling your material. Because actually we can't I mean, it would be lovely to think we can control our reader. And I was told as a young playwright, I was told, make your writing actor proof, which I thought was a bit mean because, I worked with some very, some brilliant actors who, were fantastic in the way they interpreted my material. But I think what I was being advised to do was write dialogue that no actor could interpret in a way that I didn't mean it to be interpreted. And I think as prose fiction writers, that's also what we're doing. Don't allow our writing to be interpreted by the reader as meaning something that we didn't intend. So again, point of view can play into that. It's like the choices we make have to shape a story in the way that we want it to be shaped, in the way that we intend it to be interpreted by a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it's such an interesting point about taking a story that we all know, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and thinking about the effect of if you told that story from a different point of view, from I don't know, Mummy Bear's point of view.
It gets its bowl broke. No, what is it? Its chair broken. Its bed slept in. It gets all its porridge eaten up.
Absolutely, but also it becomes a different story, really, doesn't it? I was thinking about when I was thinking preparing for today and thinking about another bestseller that we probably all know, which is Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy, and how different that would be. That's written in the third person, but how different that would be if it was all written from the first person, from Lyra, the protagonist's perspective. The worlds that's built in a story would be built in a very different way. As I guess what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
I don't know that book. I mean, I think I've seen the film. Is it Golden Compass, the film?
Yeah, that's the first in the trilogy. But I guess I was thinking of it in terms of world building is easier to do if you're writing in the third person. But I feel like I'm jumping ahead a bit there onto different types.
But actually, if you think about Goldilocks, if you come at that story from the outside, it's written as a third person perspective. Goldilocks did this. She went for a walk in the woods and she found this house and she went in and helped herself. Actually, you come away thinking, wow, what an entitled little girl.
Right.
Whereas if you, like you say, if you told it from, the middle bear's point of view, maybe that middle bear would have a certain perspective on Goldilocks herself, which might be, you spoiled brat, what are you doing sleeping in my kid's bed?
Absolutely. Yeah. So right away we can see that there's just so much nuance to this topic. So you touched on there having been a playwright, and I'm interested in what that was like moving then from writing for the stage, where it's one very clear point of view. You're writing dialogue, and then moving into a space where ostensibly there's a lot more freedom, I guess, novel writing or prose fiction writing, and how that kind of changed your relationship to point of view and narrative perspective.
Yeah, that's another really good question, because what I realise as you ask it is that there is no point of view, I don't think, in a play. When you go and watch a play, you as a member of the audience have access to the full picture. You see all the actors moving around. You might identify with one of the characters more than the others, and so your eye is drawn to them when they kind of enter the stage and move around the other characters. But there's no one force, not even the writer, controlling where your eye roves or where your emotions. I suppose as a playwright, we are controlling the audience's emotion through the shape of the story we're telling.
So by what you're saying, did it perhaps give you access to having a point of view then, becoming a prose fiction writer?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's it. So within that tableau that I was aware of as a playwright, which is a tableau, a stage picture, I could then, as a prose writer, zoom into Hamlet or Medea or whoever it might be, and see how they move through the play, how what the novel in particular, but even short stories offer you is, as a writer, is interiority. And, you know, you can play with that to various degrees. So if I'm writing from a first person point of view, then the interiority that I'm dealing with is massive. It's all interior. It's all how that character experiences the world of the novel or the story. You don't get that as a playwright, although you do get it. I mean, I came to playwriting from acting, actually. I did a drama degree at UEA, University of East Anglia in Norwich. And so actually, I think my experience of acting as a student informed, you know, the first piece I wrote, the first novel I wrote, because it almost felt like acting, but on the page, because it was a first person point of view. So kind of role playing the character that I was writing about.
That's so interesting. So there's something about the connection between a voice coming through dialogue and then a first person narrative that we would read on the page. They're the most directly linked. Would you say first person perspective or point of view is your favorite way to write prose fiction?
For sure. It's the one that comes really easily to me, and I was very surprised. You know, I'm always very surprised when I encounter other writers who find it difficult. I know Ian McEwan says that writing in the first person is cheating. I can't remember where I heard him say that. And I kind of see what he means, because, well, I find it very easy, but I know other writers don't. So maybe it's not cheating. It's just you find your kind of comfort zone or your sweet spot, and why wouldn't you stick with that? You know, if you find it easy, and because you can have a lot of fun with first person as well. You know, it's a lot of fun. And I'm writing at the moment. The thing I'm writing is not in the first person. I'm finding it really much more of a challenge. Yeah.
Really? So what would you say are the big differences? Do you feel there's more responsibility or?
More responsibility for sure. And you're stepping outside that kind of interior position to look at the whole picture. And then, I mean, I am slightly cheating it because I'm writing in the third person and I'm up close to one particular character. So in some respects, it might as well be a first person because I'm really up close. But then sometimes when I want to pull further away from that character and present a more, you know, the bigger picture, I'm finding that slightly challenging, because my first readers who are looking at the material I'm generating are saying, well, who says that? Or whose point of view is that? You know, whose voice is this? I know, well, it's mine. But that's not good enough. You know, it's like, and that goes back to the first point that we were kind of making about the importance of point of view, is that if your reader at any point is saying, well, who's talking? Who's this? Then that's a kind of indication that you failed to be adequately in control of your material. You know, the reader should never, well, unless it's intentional, I suppose, you know, you might want to play with the reader in terms of like disguising from them who's talking or who's telling the story, or disguise from them the context of the story as a kind of as part of the game that you're playing with the reader. But actually, if you're not playing that game, then it needs to be very clear, you know, where the perspective is coming from. Otherwise, the reader is asking questions and they're feeling slightly kind of discombobulated, or they're feeling lost. And I think our job as writers is to take a reader by the hand and lead them through the story, you know, in a kind, hospitable, generous way. I mean, again, you might play games with the hospitality of your character or your narrator or yourself as a writer. You might want to play games with that. But if you're telling a kind of straightforward narrative and you want your reader to follow it logically and follow it in terms of the kind of sensory experience of those characters in that space,
and to trust it.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, I can see where you're going with this. Yeah, to trust it. If you want them to trust the storytelling, then you need to be clear about it. Yeah. We wouldn't trust someone we didn't know or who didn't present themselves in a certain way, and the same rules apply to writing.
But you definitely touched on something there that I want us to come back to about the opportunity that you have as a writer with point of view to deliberately play with your readers' perceptions and levels of trust in that point of view. But just before we go there, you mentioned there about what you're working on at the moment being in the third person, but also being quite limited or focused on one particular character. And I think that probably opens up a moment for us to talk about third person narration in a bit more detail. We know that there are different kinds of third person narration that people can utilize in their writing. There is third person omniscient narration, which is where, well, I'll ask you what you think of it, but I guess the definition would be like an all-seeing eye. The author is an all-seeing eye. And then you've got that more limited perspective, where or limited or third person objective, I've heard it referred to as well, where it's very much the narrator still doesn't have an insight, an interiority, but they are sort of limited to focusing on one character. That was probably a terrible explanation of it all.
No, that was really good. That was very clear. And I think what you're talking about is that John Gardner, is his book called The Art of Fiction? I think it's called The Art of Fiction.
James Wood?
And, well, I'm James. Oh, hang on, that's James Wood, yeah. No, John Gardner, maybe his is called The Art of the Novel. Oh, I can't remember. It's on my bookshelf upstairs. So I can go and get it so that we can put it in the notes to the podcast. But he writes about psychic distance, and that being almost like a spectrum that ranges from that godlike or goddess-like position where you're right on the outside of a character in a world, and then the spectrum can, it occupies a range of positions from that outside position right to the most interior position inside a character's head.
We've got this whole range of ways we can use the third person. I just want to go back to the idea of an omniscient narrator and how that works, and to ask you whether you think a narrator can truly be omniscient, actually. Can they know everything?
Definitely. Well, maybe they can know everything, but we as readers, I think, should be quite suspicious of the notion of omniscience and the notion that, that this narrator character or the writer, and they might be separate, know everything. Because what I was very struck by, well, James Wood says it in his book, How Fiction Works, and also Nikesh Shukla says it in Your Story Matters, which is, and I was so relieved to read it, there's no such thing as omniscience. Both of them say it's impossible. And I was like, oh, phew. Because I think it's really important. And I think it's no coincidence that this is something that writers are coming to now. Because there was a time when no one would have said that. I think, when there was a time when people thought that omniscient narration was perfectly possible, but that was, a time when maybe more people believed in God or more people had respect for a certain kind of authority. And I think as we evolve as a species, we are becoming more sensitized to the fact that there is no one order or no one point of view on anything, and that actually our experience of the world is multiple. There are, multiple ways of experiencing the same physical universe that we occupy, and that's what people like Shukla and Wood are pointing out. And I think it's a really helpful thing for writers to remember that actually, even if we think we're writing omnisciently, we are still Hannah Vincent or Holly Ainley, and our notion of what constitutes the world is going to be defined by our Holly Ainley-ness or our Hannah Vincent-ness,
Yeah, and I guess then a follow-up question to that would be, would a writer ever want to remove what is inevitably their subjectivity? Would you, as a writer, want to ever try and do that?
Yes. Because part of the pleasure of writing is that control freakery that we all engage with. Being the goddess of our universe is a very nice feeling. It's why so many writers write. It feels great to be in control of, our characters and the kind of the world that we're showing a reader. That's part of the compulsion, I think, that exists in a writing practice. So yes, I'd love to assert my idea of the world on all of you, every single one of you. But I suppose, in our humility, what we have to recognise is that is impossible, or not that it's impossible, but that's what we're doing. That when I say the world is like this and this character is like this, all I'm doing is asserting my Hannah Vincentness on you as a reader. And that actually sometimes you might want to take that with a pinch of salt.
You mentioned that the project that you're currently working on is much more of a third person limited perspective. And I wonder whether you have a preference between omniscient and the limited there in the third person. Like, what's the sort of effect for you as a writer?
Yeah, again, a really good question. And I'm much more comfortable pressed up close to a character because of my, love of the first person, because I'm comfortable being in a reader's experience of the world that I'm putting them in. That's where I want to be. But I think there's a reason why I've opted for that position in the thing I'm writing. But I had some kind of rehearsal for it in the short stories that I've been writing over the last few years. And what I found interesting about the third person, a more remote third person, was that it slightly lends itself to that kind of Goldilocks kind of tone. It feels quite archaic, or feels quite apocryphal or something, in a way that the kind of up close, the third person limited doesn't feel like that. It feels more modern and more interior, obviously, I suppose. But I'm thinking about the story in my collection, She Clown and Other Stories. It's called The Mermaid and the Tick, and that is written from a third person point of view, and it is limited slightly to the husband's perspective on that. It's about a husband and wife who go on holiday and the wife is pregnant. And so I've limited it slightly. I'm kind of looking at the action through the husband's point of view because I want his vision of the pregnancy and their future child, because he's he's slightly ill at ease with that idea. And that's what I'm hoping that the reader will pick up by focusing the story through his perspective. But it's also, and this wasn't conscious at first, but when I noticed it, and this goes back to the first point we made about the importance of considering point of view, is that when I started writing that story, it felt very fairy tale-ish for some reason. The kind of the way the writing came out, as I envisaged this kind of world, was quite fairy tale-ish. And so that then when I noticed that, it made me write in a more distant way. So I'm not up close and personal with the husband.
So when you say fairy tale-ish, I mean, I imagine sort of a once upon a time feel, which you can do in the third person.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think most fairy tales are, told in that kind of third person, fairly remote. We don't go inside Goldilocks' perspective. We just see her running through the woods and pinching the bear's possessions. And I suppose what happened was, I knew that these characters were slightly kind of governed by the type. She's a mermaid and he's a kind of beast with a tick. They were also going to a cottage. There was also a game with a coin. So things like that, they struck me as being fairy tale-ish. There was a kind of an axe, and some wood chopping, which again, all the elements seemed to me to be speaking of a fairy tale-ness. And so once I noticed that, I borrowed that fairy tale kind of perspective, or not the voice of a fairy tale, but the narrative position that one would take when telling a fairy story. So it altered the writing in a very, I think it's in quite a particular way. It's not like the writing that appears in the other stories in that collection, for example. And I can't think of anything else actually that I've written in that mode.
But that's so interesting that it comes back to choice as well, which we talked about at the top of the conversation. It's a really, how narrative perspective is a really conscious, creative choice, and it's not necessarily something that you might have chosen from the outset, but you kind of make it based on all the elements that have come together in the story.
And what I think is important to say for any other writers listening is that it is a conscious choice, and that actually it's nothing to be scared of. It's, as much as perspective can be confounding, or point of view can be a kind of tricky element of our prose fiction practice. It's nothing to be scared of. It's something that you can work to your advantage. That when I noticed that particular thing that perspective gave me in that story, it unleashed a certain element of the writing that I wouldn't have found otherwise if I hadn't considered it carefully in that way. So it can gift you as a writer. It's a gift.
Oh, that's so interesting. I want to keep moving through the different perspectives, but and come on to first person again in a moment. But before I do, I just want to ask whether you've ever written a narrative that has moved or shifted between perspectives, or points of view. So you might have started in the third person and moved into the first person, for example, and whether you have experience of that, or you've read a brilliant book that does that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm sure I have read a brilliant book that does that shifts. And certainly my first novel, Alarm Girl, begins in a kind of first-person child's voice. But because it's quite an intense voice, I was worried that I couldn't sustain that, or maybe I could sustain it, but that a reader perhaps wouldn't sustain interest in it, or not that they wouldn't sustain interest in it, but that it was a big ask for a reader to kind of require them to stay in this quite limited by the virtue of the fact that Indy is a child, so there's stuff she doesn't know, and limited also, and kind of intense also, because she's in a difficult position. She's finding her life challenging, so her internal kind of monologue, if you like, is quite intense, and so to alleviate that for the reader, I then hop out of her point of view and offer different perspectives that kind of shine a light on Indy's experience of the kind of the events of the story. So I go into her father's perspective, I think maybe once or twice, from quite not a remote point of view, but definitely, third person. And I also go into her mother's experience, and I think that's first person from memory. Yeah, first person. Oh God, I wrote it a long time. Well, 2014.
But that's really interesting that by using point of view, it allowed you to kind of give the reader this more rounded experience of the characters than otherwise you might have been able to.
Yeah. It ventilates the novel slightly, it gives you kind of breathing space, gives the reader breathing space, well, and the writer, I suppose, but the reader above all. And yeah, like you say, it gives you a different perspective, literally, on Indy, so that we're in her head, we're understanding her, or we're in her mother's head and we're understanding her. But then when you then hop to another perspective, there's a kind of a real juiciness about being able to see those characters that we've been, inside their experience, and seeing them from the outside. It's kind of what we'd like to do in life, I think, isn't it? As much as, we can be intimate with other humans, our fellow humans, we're always on the outside, so we can never kind of walk in somebody else's shoes. We can walk in their shoes, but we can't get inside their skin.
Absolutely, which is the gift and I guess the playfulness that you're allowed to have as a prose fiction writer. Exactly. And I guess my question about have you ever read a book you can think of that plays with multiple perspectives was slightly loaded because I'd been thinking about A Little Life by Hannah Vincent. And regardless of whether you read it or not, it's a great example of really cleverly being able to shift between perspectives. It starts with a third person omniscient perspective. I hope I'm going to get this right, but it's kind of peppered with first person sections. And then actually very cleverly, I think, as it goes on, it gradually, the third person omniscient narration becomes more and more limited to one character. So but again, like you're saying, it allows us to kind of circle round one person and then in this case hone in on them.
And I suppose again she made some good choices in that book in terms of using perspective in that way to make her point. The point of that story is embodied in the choices she made about perspective. That actually we see this group of friends from the outside, la la la, or this is how they operate, as a group of friends. But actually look closer. This is what's going on for one particular friend, and this is why he behaves in this way.
Absolutely, it's really smart.
I suppose I'm thinking as well about, and her name always comes up when you're thinking about perspective, Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
And how she managed multiple perspectives, but in a very fluid way. So she doesn't break off a chapter and give it a character's name. She will move from, one perspective to another within the space of a paragraph sometimes. And actually, what did I read recently? Toni Morrison also does it. I think she does it in Bluest Eye, and I think she does it in Jazz.
And are we talking
very fluid?
And are we talking about? We can go there with Virginia Woolf. That very particular kind of narrative perspective or point of view, which is stream of consciousness, which obviously Virginia Woolf's really famous for, and that, as you say, there's almost like no rules to it. But actually, as you've been saying from the top, a writer's got to be completely in control. So it's sort of deceptive in that sense.
And the few times I've tried, I thought, well, Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison, if they can do it, I can do it. And the few times that I've attempted to be that fluid or to be that promiscuous with kind of viewpoint, my readers have always said, who's this speaking now? They've always pulled me up on it. So obviously you have to be Virginia Woolf or Toni Morrison to be able to do it effectively. That's the thing.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure you have to be either of those, but there's a certain audacity, isn't there, to taking or to trusting your reader to come with you on that point of view. But
it can be very useful for writers, I think, to study those writers and see, like, to literally get a passage from either of those writers and say, well, whose point of view am I in now? Okay, whose perspective am I following now? And mark it up on the page and just see. I mean, the acrobatics that they perform, shifting from one perspective to another is quite stunning.
Absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to now move us to talking about the first person because it's your favourite, and also because I think there's something really interesting in the first person that we've sort of touched on, but you also really explore in your new self-paced course you've written for us around unreliable narration. And listeners can't see, but I'm putting that in inverted commas, the word unreliable. So I want to start with the question, do you think as a reader we trust a first-person narrator more or less instinctively than a third-person, this third-person omniscient narrator?
That's a good question, because you would think so, wouldn't you? When someone addresses you directly as a reader, I did this and I did that. Because we're beautiful, humans are beautiful. We just, oh, did you? Oh, okay. I'm with you. I'm going along with you, believing everything you say. I think it's a really lovely thing to be that uncynical and to, to open our hearts to our fellow humans, whoever they are, and just to believe what they say. But I suppose when you're reading a novel or a story, the likelihood is that the writer is going to play a trick on you at some point with that I, with that first person.
Yeah.
Maybe they won't. Maybe it'll be straightforward and they've just chosen that point of view because they want an intimacy with the reader. But increasingly, I think possibly we are more, as readers, we're increasingly sophisticated, and maybe we are alert to the fact that there's some level at which we might mistrust that voice or look for the ways in which they're misconstruing their experience or misguiding us in some way.
And it's interesting because you've already said that with a third person omniscient narrator, actually we can't fully trust that because there can't fully be omniscience, but still we sort of tend to. So what are then the benefits, I suppose, of the first person of the I? I mean, it sounds like you're saying that it allows you as a writer to play and to be deliberately deceptive if you want to.
Absolutely, yeah, it does. It gives us that flexibility and that playfulness that you mentioned, yeah. And actually, we should be much more wary of any writer writing in the third person, and attempting or professing to give us an omniscient or a kind of, a more objective view of the events of a story. We should be much more suspicious of that, as we should be in life. So yes, the first person offers us definitely that playfulness, that flexibility, and that kind of interiority that, I'm certainly as a reader, that's what I go to literature for, is that companionship and the kind of intimacy and the emotional journey of a story. That's why I'm there. And I suppose a first person narration or perspective on a story would perhaps be more likely to give me that.
And so if we're talking about the fact that, I think you touch on this in your course as well, that, all narration, particularly first person narration, lies on a kind of scale of reliability. But I guess my question is, are you saying that therefore unreliability isn't necessarily a bad thing?
It depends what you're going to do with that unreliability. I can think of certain unreliable politicians, and it's a very bad thing.
Well, unreliable as a narrative voice, device. It doesn't. Yeah, as a literary device, unreliability is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah,
it's not necessarily going to take us somewhere really dark.
No, not at all. It doesn't need to be dark and twisty and kind of unreliable in a negative way, but I suppose, and again, it's kind of quite useful in terms of life as well as reading and writing. What it might alert us to is the fact that all of us are just carrying our own experience of the world, and that's all we can offer anyone else is our, disseminating our version of events or, our experience, and that's useful as readers to be alert to that. What are they telling me? Do I trust it? Can it be relied upon? Do I agree with it? Does it reflect my experience of the world? And if not, how does that impact my engagement with this character or with these events? And those are really useful questions, I think, to ask ourselves.
You talked about your first novel, Alarm Girl, and that being a child narrator. And I suppose, could you talk a little bit about, I suppose, the fact that a child's voice isn't necessarily reliable, but again, not necessarily in a deliberate negative way.
Yeah. Yes. And again, in life, you would get, if a child tells you their version of events, of course you're going to credit them with that being, well, I suppose unless they're lying to you, trying to get away with something, but you're going to trust that child's way of articulating their experience because you want to honour them and respect them as a, autonomous human being. Equally, you might think, oh, this person's only been alive 6 years, so there's a limit to what they can understand of of the world compared to maybe my experience. But that doesn't mean it's any less valid. It just means that there's a kind of a gap between you, the reader, or you, the adult, in relation to that child's perspective on events. And that is a really creative space, I think, for a writer to work in. Laying out that gap, that little chink between a child narrator's experience of the events of a novel or a story, and what the reader might understand to be the kind of events of the story and the child's place in relation to those.
Yeah, that's a as you say, a really fascinating space for all sorts of things to go wrong, I suppose, as well.
And just,
when you feel like as a reader you know more than the narrator.
Yeah. And I mean, I played with that in a more Machiavellian way in my second novel, where, hopefully the gap that opens up isn't just a gap of a character's ignorance or innocence of a certain set of circumstances. There is also, within that gap, the reader becomes aware of certain elements of that narrator's personality or their experience of the world that slightly contorts the way they might behave in the world. So it's not just a lack of understanding, which it would be, in Alarm Girl with the child narrator. It's a lack of understanding and a kind of contortedness because of Bobby, who's the narrator of the second novel.
And this is your second novel, The Weaning.
The Weaning, yeah. That actually she can't be relied upon, and because of how her mind works, which is a direct result of the lived experience she's had. And as we, the reader, understand that, we view the events of the novel in a different way, in a way that we wouldn't have looked at them in the earliest pages, perhaps. We're kind of slightly mistrustful of her, her equilibrium, in a way that perhaps when she opens the story, of course we're going to trust her. We don't know. We've got no evidence to say that we shouldn't trust her. I suppose that's what a novel does, and a story, but a novel, you've got more time to do it. It has this delicious, it goes back to the playfulness that you mentioned. It offers you this delicious opportunity to explore a movement from one set of understanding of a character or a narrator or a set of circumstances to another very different understanding of what's going on. And that's the journey you take a reader on.
And yeah, I can see now why the first person is your favourite, allowing you the space to do all this, and whether that's through the eyes of or the voice of a child or an adult. It's there's a lot of nuance to it. I want to make sure we touch on the second person. Narration in the second person before we close up, just because I think this is often perceived as a really tricky point of view, a really tricky narrative perspective. And the second person is when the narrator is using the pronoun you, so they are addressing you, the reader, directly, which, to me sounds like the most difficult, but I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what it can do. What's the potential of that second person?
I mean, I think it can operate quite similarly to the first person, actually, because we use it a lot in speech. You go upstairs and you have your lunch and you do this and you do that. That's me saying, I'm going to go upstairs and I'm going to have my lunch. We use it quite casually like that in speech, and that sometimes you can use, I think, prose writers who might use that second person can use it like that. Equally, you could, one could use it more formally, like a direct address, as if you were writing a letter. And I think two examples of that, I can't remember if they're in my online course. I think the Ocean Vuong, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, I think that might be on the online course. And that's constructed as a letter to his mother. So the address you is actually to a person, that we, the reader, understand to be the mother, his mother that he's addressing. Whereas something like Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, he's addressing, he's using you, but you is also, it's almost synonymous with the I. And so it's much more kind of fluid, less kind of formal,
more rhythmic.
And well, it feels just more gentle, it feels more like an I to me. You do this, you do that, and this is how you feel, and the effect of that is, for me, I think, it places the reader very much in that experience, because we're being told, oh, this is you're doing this, and this is how you feel. And so subliminally it's impacting us by making us go, oh, oh yeah, I did feel like that. It's almost like a magic trick. It literally places the reader in the position of that character that's being described.
That's such a good example, because I guess my instinct was to feel, and perhaps the few second-person narratives I've read, is that the you can have the opposite effect and kind of make you feel more distant. But that's exactly, a brilliant example of it pulling you in. And I know one of the short stories in your collection in She Clown is written in the second person as well, isn't it? Women of the Year. And I just wondered why you decided to go for the second person there.
I think that's the last story in the collection, and I wanted to involve the reader a bit in the way that Caleb Azuma Nelson does in Open Water. I wanted to implicate the reader in the action of that story. I want to bring them in, draw them into that circle, and it literally is a circle. It's all, well, no spoilers, because actually, there's a reason why that story comes last in the collection. So I wanted to implicate the reader in that way, and kind of, invite them in, offer that invitation, and again, literally is an invitation to the dinner.
Have you ever started a story in one perspective and then decided to change or to swap the perspective?
Yes, definitely. So with Alarm Girl, that started out as third person narration, and I couldn't make it work. Well, it started out as a play, so there was no point of view. Couldn't make it work as a play. Tried it as a third-person narration. Couldn't make it work. It wasn't until I found Indy's first-person voice that actually the kind of project unlocked for me and became doable. So that, again, is really a good example, I think, of showing you what point of view can offer. If your writing isn't working, then shift point of view and see if you can unlock it in a different perspective. It can be really a really useful creative force. I'm not going to use the word tool. I hate that. We don't have tools. We have forces, magical forces. And then also there's a story in She Clown and other stories that I tried to make work from using the second person address. And I can't remember why I switched it, but I chose the second person because I wanted to make a political point about this character at a certain stage in her life. But for whatever reason, I then reverted to I, and I can't remember at what point in the process I did make that.
It was one of those creative forces, I'm sure, that made you do it.
It overcame me.
Oh, Hannah, thank you so much. Sadly, I think we have to draw it to a close. There is so much more we could talk about, and so many other examples, I'm sure. And I hope it's kind of inspired listeners to kind of dig around in books they've read and maybe revisit them and understand why perspectives were used, or as writers to use that as an exercise, as you say, to unlock something. If it's not working, try a different point of view. But thank you so much for sharing all of that and for diving into all of this with me, because it is a complex subject.
My pleasure. I've really enjoyed discussing it with you, this thorny issue of point of view. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Another big thank you to Hannah Vincent for her time, and to you for listening. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on our website by going to the Support Us page. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a rating and a review, because this helps other writers to find us. Thanks again. Keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.